Now, that military action in the short term would probably happen in support of US-led military action.
Let's talk about Iran in relation to President Donald Trump hosting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House as tensions continue to rise across the Middle East and negotiations intensify over curbing Iran's nuclear weapons program. Netanyahu is expected to press Trump to pursue a deal that would halt Iran's uranium enrichment and rein in its support for proxy terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Talks come as the Ayatollahs in Iran celebrate the 47th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, which transformed Iran from a pro-Western monarchy into a Shia theocratic republic, emphasising anti-imperialism and strict Islamic law in governance. Let's speak to Farzan Sabet, researcher at the Geneva Graduate Institute and Iran expert. Farzan, Iran has said it will not limit uranium enrichment unless Western nations scale back sanctions that have severely strained its economy. How likely is that to happen?
Great to join today. I think it's quite unlikely. I can see room for a narrow nuclear deal. It's possible. I don't think it's likely. But under such a deal, I think the Islamic Republic would be asked to make major concessions, including zero enrichment, the removal of enriched uranium stocks, and IAEA monitoring the restoration of it, in exchange for a diffusion of the current crisis, potentially maybe limited sanctions relief. But in terms of the type of comprehensive sanctions lifting that the Islamic Republic has asked for during these talks, at least according to some officials, that seems highly unlikely to me.
Right, but you still think there is some room for a narrow deal. What do you think that would look like specifically?
Yeah, so I think what the Islamic Republic might be willing to give and what the U.S. President Trump might be able to accept would again be focused on nuclear, while the Trump administration has asked for a deal covering more issues, but what might be workable would be something focused on nuclear. Again, zero enrichment, so no enrichment happening in Iran. The removal of enriched uranium stocks, which could be used to potentially build nuclear weapons, including that 60% high enriched uranium in the country, and the restoration of IAEA monitoring. Again, I don't think it's a likely scenario, but there's a narrow window for it.
Now, we know that the Israeli Prime Minister wants a much tougher line. Israeli officials are reportedly saying the country reserves the right to take military action against Iran if it doesn't reach some sort of nuclear deal or agreement with the US. Tell us about the dynamics there in terms of their influence on Trump vis-a-vis Iran.
My understanding is that the Israelis would not be happy with a nuclear-only deal. What they've asked for, both through my own discussions with the Israeli side as well as what we've seen in the media, is potentially a much more comprehensive deal that would definitely have to address missiles, which in the current window Israel perceived as being the biggest threat emanating from the Islamic Republic, alongside the nuclear issue, as well as a cessation of support by the Islamic Republic to the so-called acts of resistance proxy groups in the region. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is visiting President Trump for a meeting. Potentially, I think, or very likely to push him to ask for a more comprehensive deal that would, at the very least, also address the missile issue alongside the nuclear issue. And failing for such a deal to materialize, I think Israel would likely undertake a military action. Now, that military action in the short term would probably happen in support of US-led military action. If that doesn't materialize, then I think an Israeli war against the Islamic Republic, along the lines of the 12-day war that we saw last year, it is quite likely in 2026, probably by the summer.
Right. I mean, let's talk about the human cost here, the promised help for all those protesters who've been killed by the regime. It just hasn't materialised, the promise from Donald Trump that help was on the way. What's that done to morale?
Of course. So I think it's definitely affected morale. I think President Trump's tweet saying, the U.S. was locked and loaded, pushing protesters to go on the street and promising to intervene should innocent protesters be killed, was one of the motivating factors that drove many protesters to the street. The fact that it hasn't materialized yet has affected morale. But what we can still see is that while the large-scale protests have been suppressed, Iranian society, having experienced such a profound level of violence, and not only during when protests were happening, but ongoing violence and attempts by the Islamic Republic to humiliate them. For example, by charging the families of killed dead protesters, kind of so-called bullet fees for getting their bodies. Despite all of this attempted kind of repression and humiliation, they remain resistance, and we see this at the funerals of families. We see these nightly chants of kind of death to Khamenei and death to the Islamic Republic. And so, while it's affected morale, the resistance at the social level continues.
I mean, it's incredibly brave to hear stories and reports like that. Do you think there is still a chance that Donald Trump will send, he said he's got a second aircraft carrier there in the Middle East ready to strike if there is any more suppression. But is that really a hollow threat?
I don't think it's a hollow threat. President Trump put down a red line on this issue. I believe even kind of restrainers administration, like Vice President J.D. Vance, said that given that he's, or was reported to have said, given that he set down that red line, just for the sake of his own credibility, he would be kind of forced to act on it and to enforce it. That being said, I think it's hard to say. What's harder is to speculate about the kind of military action the U.S. will take. Will it be symbolic attack? Will it be kind of a major but one-off operation? Would it be a limited war, or would it be kind of a large-scale war? I think now that the U.S. has all of these assets in place, it's likely to be on the higher end of that spectrum. And I do think military action is likely, but it's hard to say exactly what type it'll be and when it will come.
Right. I mean, and it is the when, I suppose, that's important. I mean, is it less likely that the regime will now fall? It may never have fallen, of course, but is it that less likely?
Listen, if anyone thinks that any single kind of act or action will lead to the fall of the regime, I think they're likely to be disappointed. What we do see is a crisis on the economic level in terms of domestic legitimacy and stability, in terms of security, in terms of, broad set of issues. This crisis, it started maybe 8 years ago, but it's intensified over time. And we see the regime weakening. So I think that, whereas before the 12-day war, the likelihood of the fall of the regime might have been conceived as being quite low. Since the war, and especially since these protests, the odds are rising. But that might be a 6-month, 12-month, 24-month, 30-week. We don't know exactly how long it'll take. But I think that the regime's chance of survival is decreasing over time.
Right. Oh, you do think that? I mean, that brings us back to the beginning of the interview in terms of self-preservation for the Ayatollahs in Iran. Surely they would give more in order to get some economic support and make it easier for people, which might in turn lessen the protesters' sort of angst.
Listen, with the amount of leverage that the U.S. has built and the vulnerable position that the Iranian government is in, my understanding is that large-scale economic and sanctions really is not even on the table right now. Okay. Now, if there is a large-scale conflict, what could happen in the aftermath of that conflict, that's a different story, and what the Islamic Republic would be willing to do then. I don't think we're quite there yet.
Farzan Sabet, researcher at the Geneva Graduate Institute and Iran expert.